Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
On Thanksgiving, my family kicked me out. Why? Because giving them $4,000 a month wasn't enough. They wanted more. But when my wife opened my eyes to what was really going on, I decided to take action. What I did next left them crying, and not for the reasons you'd expect. Thanksgiving had always been a cherished tradition for my wife and me. A day filled with family, laughter, and my mom's famous stuffing. This year, though, the mood was different. As we pulled into my parents' driveway with a warm pumpkin pie balanced on my lap, I noticed the tension in my wife's smile. She could sense something I hadn't yet realized. This wasn't going to be the peaceful holiday I'd been hoping for. We were greeted at the door by my mom, who hugged us quickly before stepping back and saying, "Oh, good, you're here. We were just talking about you." Her tone was light, but her eyes carried something else. Anticipation, maybe even calculation. As we settled into the living room, the usual small talk felt unusually strained. My mom started with her usual comments about how things have been hard lately. She thanked me for the financial support I'd been providing, but her gratitude was laced with a subtle implication. It wasn't enough. At first, I brushed it off. My family had a way of weaving their financial struggles into conversations, hinting at their needs without ever outright asking for help. It was something I'd grown used to, even if it sometimes left a sour taste in my mouth. But then my sister joined in. It must be nice to not have to worry about car payments," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Meanwhile, I'm out here busting but just to keep up." Her words stung, but I tried to deflect. "It's not like I'm swimming in money," I said with a nervous laugh. "I've got my own bills to pay, just like everyone else." "Sure," she said, rolling her eyes. "But you're not helping everyone else, are you? You're helping us. Or at least, you're supposed to be." Her tone sharpened as she spoke, and I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. My wife glanced at me, her eyes wide with concern, but she stayed silent. By the time dinner was served, the tension had reached a boiling point. My mom, who had been unusually quiet during the meal, finally set down her fork and turned to me. Her tone was sharp, her words cutting. "You could be doing more," she said, her voice firm. $4,000 a month is barely enough to cover the basics. "Don't you care about your family?" I froze, the words hitting me like a slap in the face. $4,000 a month. Money I'd been sending religiously, sacrificing my own savings and plans, wasn't enough? Before I could respond, my dad chimed in. "We're not asking for much," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "We just need a little more to get by. Isn't that what family is for?" I could feel my wife's hand on my arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. But inside, I was boiling. $4,000 isn't enough? I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That's nearly half of what I make." Instead of backing down, my mom doubled down. "We've done so much for you," she said, her voice rising. "We raised you, supported you, gave you everything we could. And now, when we need you the most, you're turning your back on us?" My sister jumped in, piling on. "Yeah, it's not like you're struggling. You could afford to give more if you really cared." The accusations hit me hard. I looked around the table, at the family I'd worked so hard to support, and felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. My contributions had been taken for granted, reduced to a number that apparently wasn't high enough to earn their respect. For the rest of the meal, I barely spoke. My appetite was gone, replaced by a growing realization that my family's gratitude was conditional, based not on what I'd given, but on what they thought they were owed. As we drove home that night, my wife broke the silence. "We need to talk about this," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "This isn't okay. You deserve better." I nodded, my mind racing. She was right, of course, but I wasn't sure how to fix a problem that had been years in the making. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about gratitude, but this year, it had shown me just how little of it my family truly had. The room fell into an eerie silence after my mom's words. My wife's hand tightened on my arm, a silent plea for calm, but my mind was spinning. $4,000 a month wasn't enough? The sacrifices I'd made, canceling trips, skipping dinners out, holding off on things I wanted, none of it mattered to them. I looked at my family, searching for some hint of understanding, but all I saw were expectant faces. When I finally found my voice, it trembled, not with fear, but with frustration. "I've been doing everything I can," I said, my tone measured but strained. "I send you $4,000 every month. That's nearly half of what I make. I have my own bills to pay, my own life to manage, and I'm already giving you more than most people would." But my reasoning fell on deaf ears. My dad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a dismissive huff. "If you cared about this family, you'd figure it out," he said, his voice cold and judgmental. "It's not like you're struggling." His words cut deep. Not struggling? Did he have any idea how tight things had been for my wife and me? How many times we'd had to put our own goals on hold because I was funneling money to them every month? Before I could respond, my sister chimed in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Must be nice to have money to spare." Meanwhile, I'm drowning in bills, but nobody's handing me a golden ticket. I turned to her, stunned. "Are you serious right now? You think this is easy for me? I've been breaking my back trying to help you guys, and instead of a thank you, I get this." She rolled her eyes, unbothered. "Don't act like you're some kind of martyr. You're not the only one who has responsibilities." The entitlement in her voice made my blood boil. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the complete lack of gratitude, the way she dismissed everything I'd done as if it were nothing. The argument escalated quickly. My dad started listing off the things they still needed: home repairs, medical bills, my sister's mounting car payments. My mom chimed in about how the cost of groceries had gone up and how she didn't know how they'd manage without me. It was a chorus of demands, and no one seemed to care that I was already doing more than I could comfortably afford. "Do you even hear yourselves?" I said, my voice rising. "I've given up so much to make sure you're taken care of, and it's still not enough for you. What more do you want from me?" My mom's face hardened. "We want you to stop thinking about yourself for once," she said. "You act like you're doing us this huge favor, but this is your responsibility. We're your family." That word, responsibility, felt like a slap in the face. For years, I carried the weight of their expectations, believing it was my duty to provide for them. But now, for the first time, I started to question it. Where was their responsibility to me? As the argument raged on, my wife stayed quiet, her gaze flickering between me and my family. I could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands gripped the edge of her chair. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Enough," she said, cutting through the chaos. "This isn't fair, to him or to any of us. He's done more than enough, and instead of being grateful, you're demanding more? How is that okay?" The room fell silent, all eyes on her. My mom opened her mouth to respond, but my wife wasn't finished. "You're treating him like an ATM, not a son. And if you can't see how unfair that is, then maybe it's time we rethink this entire arrangement." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, no one spoke. My dad looked away, my sister glared, and my mom's face twisted in indignation. "Maybe you should leave," my mom finally said, her voice trembling with anger. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "If you can't be part of this family, then maybe you don't belong here," my dad said, standing up and pointing toward the door. I stared at them, disbelief washing over me. After everything I'd done, this was how they repaid me? By kicking me out because I couldn't give them more? My wife placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch grounding me. "Let's go," she said softly. I stood up, the weight of their rejection settling over me like a heavy blanket. As we walked to the door, my sister muttered under her breath, "Figures." I didn't look back. The drive home was silent, the tension thick in the air. Finally, my wife spoke, her voice tinged with sadness. "You deserve better than this," she said. Her words broke something open inside me. For years, I told myself that this was normal, that supporting my family was just part of being a good son. But now, for the first time, I saw things differently. She was right. I did deserve better, and it was time to start demanding it. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. After the heated argument at the dinner table, I thought things might cool down, that we could all take a breath and have a real conversation. But as soon as I mentioned why I couldn't give them more, it became clear there was no room for understanding. "We're trying to save for a house," I explained, my voice steady but strained. "My wife and I have been putting off starting a family because we're trying to build something stable. I want to help you, but I can't give more than I already am. It's not sustainable." Instead of sympathy or even a sliver of understanding, I was met with icy stares. My mom's face twisted into something unrecognizable, an expression I'd never seen before. "Oh, so your life is more important than ours?" she said, her voice rising. "We're struggling, and you're telling us you care more about your own plans?" I shook my head, frustrated. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I have to find a balance. I've been giving you $4,000 every month for years. It's not like I'm not helping, but I have to think about my future too." Her response was sharp and immediate. "If you're not going to help us, Then you're no better than a stranger, she spat. Maybe you should just leave. At first, I thought she was bluffing. My mom had a way of saying dramatic things in the heat of the moment, and I figured this was just another example. But then my dad stood up, his expression hard and cold, and walked over to the door. He opened it with deliberate slowness, the creak of the hinges echoing in the tense silence. You heard her, he said, gesturing toward the exit. If you're not willing to step up for this family, there's the door. For a moment, I just stared at him, my mind racing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything I'd done for them, sacrificing my own dreams, bending over backward to make sure they were taken care of, they were kicking me out because I couldn't give them more? I looked at my mom, hoping for some kind of sign that she didn't mean it, that she would step in and stop this madness. But she just sat there, her arms crossed and her expression unyielding. My sister, too, remained silent, watching the scene unfold with a smug look on her face. My wife broke the silence, her voice calm but resolute. Let's go, she said, placing a hand on my arm. I nodded, my heart pounding as I rose from my seat. We gathered our coats in silence, the weight of their rejection pressing down on me with every step toward the door. My dad didn't move, his hand still resting on the doorknob as we passed by. As we stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I glanced back once, half expecting my mom to call out, to say she didn't mean it, to stop me from leaving. But the door shut firmly behind us, cutting off any chance of reconciliation in that moment. The drive home was heavy with unspoken words. My wife sat beside me, her hand resting on mine as I gripped the steering wheel. I couldn't tell if the knot in my stomach was from anger, sadness, or a mix of both. Finally, she broke the silence. You didn't deserve that, she said softly. Her words brought a lump to my throat. Maybe I should have done more, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No, she said firmly. You've done more than enough. This isn't about you not giving enough. It's about them not appreciating what you've already done. They're taking advantage of you, and it's not fair. I nodded, but her words didn't bring much comfort. It was hard to reconcile the family I thought I had with the people who had just kicked me out of their home. I replayed the scene in my mind over and over, trying to pinpoint the exact moment things had gone so wrong. As we pulled into our driveway, my wife squeezed my hand. You need to start thinking about what's best for us, she said gently. We can't keep living like this, sacrificing everything for people who don't appreciate it. I knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. For years, I had told myself that helping my family was the right thing to do, that it was my duty as a son. But now, I couldn't ignore the reality staring me in the face. My sacrifices weren't enough for them, and they never would be. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I made a silent vow to myself. Things are going to change. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I couldn't keep living under the weight of their expectations. It was time to take back control of my life, even if it meant walking away from the people who had always claimed to love me. The silence in the car was deafening, the tension so thick it felt like a physical presence. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my knuckles turning white. My wife stared out the window, her reflection in the glass flickering with the passing streetlights. It wasn't until we were halfway home that she finally spoke, her voice soft but edged with frustration. Why do you let them treat you like this? Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't respond right away, my mind racing. I had asked myself that question countless times over the years, but had never been brave enough to answer it honestly. Instead, I'd always relied on the same excuses. They need me. I'm the only one who can help. It's my duty as their son. But hearing her say it out loud, so plainly, forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding for far too long. I don't know, I finally admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I guess I thought I was doing the right thing. They're my family. I thought helping them was what I was supposed to do. My wife turned to me, her eyes filled with both sympathy and determination. Helping them is one thing, she said. But what you're doing isn't help. It's enabling. They don't appreciate what you do for them. They just take, and it's never enough. Don't you see that? Her words stung, but deep down, I knew she was right. I'd spent years bending over backward for my family, giving up my own comfort and security to ensure theirs. And yet, they acted as if I owed them more, as if everything I had done wasn't a kindness, but an obligation. I thought they needed me, I said, my voice cracking. I thought I was doing the right thing. They might need you, my wife said, her tone softening, but not like this. They're not trying to stand on their own because they know you'll always be there to catch them. They're not even trying to appreciate you. And that's not fair. to you or to us? We pulled into the driveway, the car idling as neither of us moved to get out. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than the events of the evening. I guess I never really thought about it like that, I admitted. I wanted to be a good son. I didn't want to let them down. You're a good son, she said firmly, reaching out to take my hand. But there's a difference between being a good son and letting them walk all over you. You've done more than enough for them. You deserve to have your own life too. Her words stirred something inside me, an anger, not at my wife or even my family, but at myself. How had I let it get to this point? How had I allowed myself to believe that my worth was tied to how much I could give? For years, I had told myself that sacrificing for my family was noble, that putting their needs above my own was the right thing to do. But now, for the first time, I was starting to see how one-sided it all was. My wife was right. They didn't appreciate me. They didn't see my sacrifices as acts of love. They saw them as their due. That night, after we had gone inside and settled into bed, I couldn't sleep. My wife had drifted off, her breathing steady and calm, but my mind was racing. I replayed the events of Thanksgiving in my head, every word, every accusation, every demand. The looks on their faces when I told them I couldn't give more. The way my dad had opened the door and told me to leave. The way my sister had smirked as I walked out. I thought about all the times I had gone out of my way to help them. The vacations I had skipped, the raises I had celebrated quietly because I knew the money would go straight to them. The dreams my wife and I had put on hold. And for what? To be told I wasn't doing enough? To be kicked out of their house on a holiday meant for gratitude? In the quiet of the night, a realization washed over me, both liberating and devastating. My family's love wasn't unconditional. It was transactional. As long as I kept giving, they would accept me. But the moment I set a boundary, the moment I prioritized myself, I became expendable. It hurt to admit, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, over coffee, I shared my thoughts with my wife. She listened patiently, nodding as I spoke. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For finally seeing what I've been seeing all along," she said. "You deserve better. And it's okay to say no. It's okay to put yourself first sometimes." Her words stayed with me throughout the day, a small but steady beacon of clarity. I wasn't sure what my next steps would be, but one thing was certain. Things had to change. For years, I had been trying to fix everything for my family, believing it was my responsibility to make their lives easier. But now, I was starting to see that the only life I could truly fix was my own. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start. That night felt like an endless loop of thoughts and regrets. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every word from Thanksgiving replayed in my mind like a broken record. My mom's accusations, my dad's cold dismissal, my sister's smug remarks. They all echoed, blending with my wife's piercing question. "Why do you let them treat you like this?" For years, I convinced myself that I was helping my family, that what I was doing was selfless and noble. But now, in the silence of the night, I couldn't help but wonder, was it really help if it only created more dependency? When morning came, I still didn't have answers. What I did have was a sense of urgency, an overwhelming need to make sense of everything. I decided to call my best friend, someone who had known me for years and wasn't afraid to tell me the truth, even when it hurt. Over coffee, I laid it all out for him. The monthly payments, the escalating demands, the way Thanksgiving had spiraled out of control. I told him about the guilt I felt every time I said no to my family, about how I'd spent years sacrificing my own happiness to make theirs possible. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and said something that cut straight through my defenses. "Man, you're not helping them," he said. "You're just teaching them to rely on you instead of figuring things out for themselves." I blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of his words. "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Think about it. Every time they run into trouble, they come to you, right? Because they know you'll fix it. They don't have to figure out how to manage their money, how to budget, how to make sacrifices, because you're doing all of that for them. And the more you do it, the more they expect it. They're not struggling because they can't manage. They're struggling because they don't have to." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. For the first time, I saw the situation for what it really was. My family wasn't helpless. They weren't incapable of managing their lives without me. They were choosing not to because it was easier to rely on me than to take responsibility for themselves. The realization was both liberating and devastating. I'd spent so much time justifying their behavior, convincing myself that they needed me, that I was the glue holding everything together. But now I could see that I wasn't helping them. I was enabling them. What do I do? I asked, my voice shaky. How do I fix this? You don't, he said simply. You can't fix this for them. The only thing you can do is stop enabling them and let them figure it out for themselves. It's not going to be easy, and they're not going to like it, but it's the only way they'll ever learn. I left that conversation with a heavy heart, but also a newfound sense of clarity. For so long, I'd been caught in a cycle of guilt and obligation, believing that my family's happiness depended on my sacrifices. But now, I realized that cycle had to end. That evening, I sat down with my wife and told her everything. My conversation with my best friend, the realization that I'd been enabling my family, and my decision to finally put a stop to it. She listened quietly, her eyes soft with understanding. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. I'm proud of you, she said. This isn't going to be easy, but it's the right thing to do, for them and for us. Her support gave me the strength I needed to take the next step. I knew that cutting off the financial support wasn't going to be simple, and it wasn't going to be well received. But it was necessary. The following day, I drafted a plan. I'd sit down with my family and explain everything, why I was stopping the payments, what I learned about enabling, and how this decision wasn't about punishing them, but about giving them the chance to take responsibility for their own lives. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. I knew they would be angry, that they would lash out and try to guilt me into changing my mind. But I also knew I couldn't back down. For the first time in years, I was prioritizing my own happiness and well-being. I was setting boundaries, not out of spite, but out of love for myself, for my wife, and even for my family, in the hope that this tough love would ultimately help them grow. As I prepared for what was sure to be a difficult conversation, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear of the backlash I knew was coming, but relief in knowing that I was finally breaking free from a toxic dynamic that had controlled my life for far too long. This was my turning point, and while I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I was done being their safety net. It was time for all of us to stand on our own. Deciding to cut off the monthly payments wasn't a choice I made lightly. For years, those payments had been my way of trying to keep the peace, of showing my family that I cared. But now, I realized they had come at a cost. My own happiness and my wife's. When I told my wife what I wanted to do, she listened intently, her expression a mix of relief and concern. Are you ready for the backlash? She asked. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. I have to be, I said. This can't keep going. They've been relying on me for too long, and I'm not helping them by letting it continue. We spent hours talking it through, weighing the pros and cons, rehearsing what I would say. By the time I picked up the phone to call my parents, I felt prepared, or at least as prepared as I could be. The conversation started civilly enough. My mom answered the phone with her usual cheery tone, but it quickly turned guarded when I told her we needed to talk. Is everything okay? She asked. Not really, I admitted. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I need to make some changes. She was silent for a moment, and I could feel her apprehension through the phone. What kind of changes? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm going to stop the monthly payments, I said. It's not sustainable for me or for my marriage, and I need to focus on building a future for myself and my wife. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. When my mom finally spoke, her voice was trembling. I can't believe this, she said, her tone thick with emotion. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? I try to stay calm, reminding myself of the plan I'd rehearsed. Mom, I'm not repaying you. This isn't about repayment. It's about me realizing that I've been enabling a pattern that isn't healthy for any of us. Her response was immediate and biting. You call helping your family unhealthy? We're struggling, and all we've ever asked for is your support. Now you're just going to leave us to fend for ourselves? Before I could answer, my dad's voice boomed in the background. Let me talk to him. The phone was passed to him, and his tone was sharp and accusatory. What the hell is this about? He demanded. You're cutting us off? Just like that. It's not just like that, Dad, I said firmly. I've been giving you $4,000 a month for years. That's more than most people would do, and it's put a strain on my life. I can't keep sacrificing my future like this. His response was explosive. That's selfish, he said. You're turning your back on us. If you can't take care of your family, then what kind of son are you? Hearing those words broke something inside me. For years, I carried the weight of being the good son, the reliable one who always stepped up when things got hard. But now, I saw how conditional their love and respect truly were. I'm the kind of son who's done more than enough, I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. I love you, but I can't keep doing this. It's time for you to take responsibility for yourselves. The conversation spiraled after that. My mom got back on the phone, crying and pleading, accusing me of abandoning them. My sister chimed in, calling me selfish and ungrateful. By the time I hung up, I felt emotionally drained. My wife sat beside me, her hand on my shoulder, offering silent support. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the conversation settle over me. Lighter, I admitted, though a part of me still felt guilty. It's going to take time to adjust, but I know I made the right decision. Over the next few days, the backlash continued. My parents left voicemails filled with guilt trips and anger, while my sister sent me long, accusatory texts about how I was ruining the family. But I didn't waver. Every time I felt the pull of guilt, I reminded myself of the sacrifices I had already made, of the toll it had taken on my life and my marriage. This wasn't about abandoning my family. It was about setting boundaries that should have been in place years ago. The first month without the payments was the hardest. I knew they were struggling, and part of me wanted to step in and fix everything like I always had. But I resisted, trusting that this tough love was what they needed to learn how to stand on their own. Meanwhile, my wife and I started to feel the difference almost immediately. Without the monthly payments draining our finances, we were able to save for the first time in years. We talked about plans we'd put on hold for so long: buying a house, starting a family, taking a vacation. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not for someone else's expectations. And while it was a painful transition, I knew it was the right one. Cutting them off wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my life, my autonomy, and my future. And as hard as it was, I knew I'd never go back to the way things were. After years of living paycheck to paycheck, it was almost surreal to have control over my finances again. Cutting off the monthly payments to my family felt like removing a weight I'd been carrying for far too long. The first month without the $4,000 transfer felt strange. I had to stop myself from instinctively budgeting it out of habit. But as the weeks went by, I started to see the possibilities that came with reclaiming that money. My wife and I sat down one evening, a notebook spread out between us, and began mapping out our goals. Buying a house had always been our dream, but it had felt impossibly out of reach while I was supporting my family. Now, for the first time, it felt achievable. "We could actually do this," my wife said, her eyes lighting up as she ran her fingers over a brochure for a neighborhood we'd been eyeing for years. "We could start looking by next spring if we save aggressively." Her excitement was contagious. The thought of having a place to call our own, a space where we could finally settle down and start building the life we'd dreamed of, filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. Beyond the house, I started thinking about the things I had put off for years, the goals and aspirations I'd sidelined in the name of family obligations. One idea stood out above the rest, a side business I'd been daydreaming about since college. I'd always wanted to open a small online store, something that combined my love of woodworking and design. Over the years, I'd made small projects here and there, furniture pieces for friends, custom shelves for our apartment, but I'd never had the time or resources to turn it into something more. Now, with the extra money in our budget, the dream felt within reach. I started small, investing in better tools and setting up a dedicated workspace in the corner of our garage. My wife helped me create a website, and together, we brainstormed ideas for branding and marketing. The work was hard, but it was fulfilling in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Every evening spent sanding wood, every late night tweaking the website felt like a step towards something meaningful, something that was entirely mine. The difference in our lives was immediate and profound. Without the financial strain of supporting my family, my wife and I found ourselves enjoying the little things we'd missed out on for so long. We started going on date nights again, exploring new restaurants, and taking weekend trips to places we'd always talked about but never had the budget for. It wasn't just the money, it was the sense of freedom of finally being able to live life on our own terms. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building a future instead of pouring everything into a bottomless pit. My wife noticed the change in me too. "You're lighter," she said one evening as we sat on the couch, scrolling through house listings. "It's like you've finally let go of something that was holding you back." She was right. The guilt and obligation that had weighed on me for so long were fading, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose. I realized that by constantly sacrificing for my family, I had been neglecting my own happiness. Now I was finally prioritizing myself and the life I wanted to build. The side business began to pick up steam. Orders started coming in, slowly at first, but enough to keep me busy. I found myself looking forward to the hours I spent in the garage, crafting pieces by hand and seeing the fruits of my labor come to life. One day, as I packed up a custom bookshelf for shipping, I thought about how far I'd come. A year ago, I never would have imagined having the time or energy to pursue something like this. I'd been so consumed by the demands of my family that I'd forgotten what it felt like to chase my own dreams. Now, those dreams were becoming a reality. And while the road to get here had been painful, I knew it was worth every difficult conversation and sleepless night. As my wife and I continued to save for our house, we started talking about what the future might look like, what kind of home we wanted, where we wanted to live, and even when we might be ready to start a family of our own. Those conversations felt different now. They weren't tinged with the frustration of delayed plans or the fear of financial strain. Instead, they were filled with hope and excitement, a sense of possibility that had been missing for so long. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life. I wasn't living under the weight of someone else's expectations or sacrificing my happiness for people who didn't appreciate it. I was investing in myself, my wife, and the future we wanted to build together. And it felt incredible. It didn't take long for my family's struggles to surface once the payment stopped. For years, my monthly contributions had been the safety net they relied on, allowing them to maintain their lifestyle without making any meaningful changes. Without that cushion, reality hit them hard. My mom was the first to reach out. She called a week after the payments ended, her voice carefully neutral, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of desperation. "Things have been really tight," she said, tiptoeing around the subject. "Groceries are more expensive, and we're behind on a few bills. I don't suppose you could help us out, just for this month?" I could hear the hope in her voice, the expectation that I'd cave like I always had. But this time, I didn't. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said gently but firmly. "I can't do that anymore. You and Dad will need to figure out a budget that works without my help." There was a long pause, and then her tone shifted. "You don't understand how hard this is for us," she said, frustration seeping into her words. "We're your parents. We've always been there for you. Doesn't family mean anything to you?" Her words stung, but I held my ground. "Family means a lot to me," I said. "But supporting you the way I wasn't helping anyone. You need to find a way to manage on your own." Over the next few weeks, the calls became more frequent. Each one followed a similar pattern. My mom would start off friendly, easing into the conversation before bringing up their struggles. When I didn't budge, she'd escalate, using guilt and emotional manipulation to try to wear me down. "Do you know how humiliating this is for us?" she said during one particularly heated call. "We're supposed to be retired, not worrying about whether we can pay the electric bill. Maybe it's time to look at other options," I suggested. "You could downsize the house or pick up part-time work to help with expenses." Her response was immediate and indignant. "We shouldn't have to do that. You're supposed to help your family." The more she pushed, the more I realized how deeply ingrained their sense of entitlement had become. They didn't see my contributions as a gift or a kindness. They saw them as something they were owed. My sister was even less subtle. She sent me a long, angry text one evening, filled with accusations and thinly veiled insults. "This is all your fault," she wrote. "You've left us in a horrible position. And for what? So you can go buy a house and play happy family? How selfish can you be?" Reading her message, I felt a wave of emotions, anger, sadness, even a twinge of guilt. But beneath it all, there was a sense of clarity. Her words only reinforced what I already knew. They weren't taking responsibility for their own lives, and they expected me to shoulder the blame for their choices. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that would change her perspective, and engaging in another argument would only drain my energy. Instead, I deleted the message and reminded myself why I had made this decision in the first place. As the months went on, the calls and messages slowed. though the resentment from my family was still palpable. I heard through mutual relatives that my parents were struggling to keep up with their bills and had even started selling off some of their belongings to make ends meet. At first, I felt a pang of guilt. No matter how much I tried to distance myself emotionally, they were still my family, and a part of me wanted to step in and fix things like I always had. But then I reminded myself of what my wife and I had discussed, of the importance of boundaries and letting them take responsibility for their own lives. They weren't helpless. They had resources, skills, and options. They just hadn't been forced to use them before because I'd always been there to bail them out. Now, they had to figure it out on their own. The most surprising part was how liberating it felt to let go of that responsibility. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of their financial struggles on my shoulders. I wasn't waking up in the middle of the night, worrying about how I'd make ends meet while still supporting them. Instead, I was focusing on my own life, on my marriage, my goals, and the future my wife and I were building together. And while I still cared about my family, I finally understood that caring didn't mean sacrificing my happiness for theirs. They had to learn how to stand on their own, even if it meant facing some difficult truths along the way. Looking back, I realized how much my family's struggles had shaped my own sense of worth. I'd spent so many years believing that my value came from what I could give, from how much I could sacrifice to make their lives easier. But now I saw things differently. It wasn't my job to fix their problems. It wasn't my responsibility to carry the weight of their choices. And it wasn't selfish to prioritize my own happiness and well-being. Watching them struggle was hard, but it was also necessary. They needed to learn how to navigate their own challenges, and I needed to learn how to let go. In the end, it wasn't about abandoning them. It was about giving them the space to grow. And maybe, just maybe, they would come out stronger on the other side. Months had passed since I had cut off the payments, and in that time, my life had transformed in ways I hadn't thought possible. My wife and I were thriving, our savings were growing, and the stress that had once felt like a constant weight on my chest had all but disappeared. The same couldn't be said for my family. Though I had distanced myself from the day-to-day drama, I occasionally heard updates through relatives. My parents had started renting out a room in their house to cover expenses, and my sister had taken on a part-time job to make ends meet. It wasn't the end of the world, but for them, it must have felt close to it. So, when my phone rang one quiet afternoon and my dad's name flashed on the screen, I wasn't sure what to expect. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I was wondering if we could talk. In person." There was a pause, and then he added, "I'd like to come over if that's okay." When he arrived at my house later that evening, I was immediately struck by how different he looked. The man who stood on my doorstep wasn't the stern, unyielding figure I'd grown up with. His shoulders were slouched, his expression tired, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before: vulnerability. "Thanks for letting me come by," he said as he stepped inside. We sat in the living room, the awkward silence stretching between us like a chasm. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke. "I wanted to talk to you about everything, about how things went down." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "We've been wrong," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Your mom, your sister, and we took advantage of you. We leaned on you too much, and we didn't think about what it was costing you. I'm sorry." Hearing those words was surreal. For so long, I had waited for them to acknowledge what they had done, to take responsibility for how their actions had affected me. And now, here he was saying the words I never thought I'd hear. "It wasn't just the money," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It was how you made me feel, like nothing I did was ever enough. I wanted to help because I love you, but it got to a point where it felt like that love was one-sided." He nodded, his expression pained. "I know, and I hate that we made you feel that way. When you cut us off, it was a wake-up call. At first, we were angry. We felt betrayed. But the more we thought about it, the more we realized you were right. We weren't taking responsibility for ourselves. We were just expecting you to fix everything." I leaned back in my chair, letting his words sink in. This wasn't the tearful, dramatic apology I had imagined during those nights when I lay awake, replaying every argument in my mind. But it felt genuine, and that was enough. "We've had to make some changes," he continued, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Your mom started doing bookkeeping for a local business, and I'm helping a neighbor with handyman work. It's not easy, but we're managing." I nodded. "That's good. It's important to learn how to stand on your own." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of shame and gratitude. "I want you to know, I'm proud of you. For standing up for yourself, for setting boundaries, even when it was hard. It's not easy to do what you did, but it was the right thing. For all of us." His words caught me off guard. I had spent so long feeling like the villain in this story. like I was the one who had let them down. But hearing him say he was proud of me, it was like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying had been lifted. Before he left, we stood by the door, the awkwardness between us replaced by something softer. "Thank you for letting me come by," he said again. "Thank you for coming," I replied. "And for being honest. It means a lot." As I watched him walk back to his car, I felt a strange sense of closure. Things weren't perfect, and they might never be. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the same page. This wasn't the ending I had expected, but it was a new beginning, one built on honesty, respect, and a willingness to grow. And that was enough. Today, my relationship with my family feels like a different chapter entirely. The dynamic that once defined so much of my life, the constant giving, the endless sacrifices, no longer exists. They no longer rely on me for money, and I no longer carry the weight of their expectations. It wasn't an easy transition, and there were moments when I questioned if I had made the right choice. But now, as I look around at the life I've built with my wife, I know it was the best decision I could have made. Cutting off the financial support wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my happiness, my autonomy, and my future. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm truly living for myself, not for the approval or demands of others. My family has changed in their own way, too. While we'll never fully erase the past, I can see that they've started to grow in ways they wouldn't have if I hadn't set boundaries. My mom calls me every so often, but now, the conversations are different. She doesn't ask for money anymore, and she no longer tries to guilt me into fixing their problems. Instead, we talk about her new job, about how she's been learning to manage the household budget more effectively. There's a sense of pride in her voice that wasn't there before, a recognition that she's capable of standing on her own. Even my dad, who had always been the most resistant to change, has softened. The last time we spoke, he told me about a repair project he was working on for a neighbor. "It's honest work," he said, almost sheepishly. "Keeps me busy." It wasn't much, but it was something, a step toward independence, a sign that he was finally taking responsibility for his own life. As for my sister, our relationship is still strained. She struggled the most with the shift, unable or unwilling to let go of the resentment she felt after I cut them off. She still sees me as the villain in the story, the brother who abandoned his family for the sake of his own comfort. But I've made peace with that. I know I can't change her perspective, and I've stopped trying to. My worth isn't tied to her approval or anyone else's, and I refuse to let her anger drag me back into the toxic patterns I worked so hard to escape. Instead, I've focused my energy on the relationships that truly matter, the one I have with my wife, the one I'm building with myself, and the evolving connection I have with my parents. Looking back, I can see how far I've come, not just financially, but emotionally. The decision to stand up for myself wasn't just a turning point in my relationship with my family. It was a turning point in my life. My wife has been my anchor through it all, the person who saw my worth even when I couldn't. Together, we've built a life that feels full of possibility, a home filled with laughter, shared dreams, and a sense of partnership that I never take for granted. The woodworking business I started has grown into something I'm incredibly proud of. What started as a side project in our garage has become a source of both income and joy. Each piece I craft feels like a tangible reminder of how far I've come, a symbol of the life I've built for myself. Most importantly, I've learned to value myself in ways I never did before. I've learned that love and respect have to go both ways, that it's okay to set boundaries, and that I don't have to sacrifice my own happiness to prove my worth to anyone. When I think about that Thanksgiving years ago, I don't feel anger or regret anymore. Instead, I feel gratitude. It was a wake-up call I didn't know I needed, a turning point that forced me to take a hard look at my life and make changes that were long overdue. Today, I feel free, not just from the financial burden, but from the emotional weight that came with it. Free to pursue my dreams, to nurture my relationships, and to live a life that's authentically mine. And while my journey with my family isn't perfect, it's real. We've all had to grow and adapt in our own ways. And that growth has brought a sense of clarity and closure I never thought I'd find. For the first time in years, I can look forward without the shadow of guilt or obligation clouding my vision. I'm building a future that feels full of promise, and I'm proud of the person I've become along the way. I may have started this journey feeling like I had lost something, but in the end, I gained everything I truly needed.